The hum of the aircraft cabin was filled with the chatter of passengers settling into their seats, the rustling of carry-on bags being stowed, and the occasional ding of the overhead announcements. It was just another routine flight, until it wasn't. Dr. Maya Thompson, a well-respected physician, adjusted her seatbelt and glanced out the window, watching the runway lights flicker in the early evening haze. She had spent the last 3 days at a medical conference, sharing her expertise on emergency response procedures. Exhausted but satisfied, she was looking forward to a quiet flight home. Across the aisle, passengers were engaged in their own pre-flight rituals, scrolling through their phones, adjusting their headrests, or exchanging small talk with their seatmates. Flight attendants moved through the narrow walkway, checking seatbelts and making last-minute preparations before takeoff. That's when it happened. A blonde flight attendant, her uniform crisp and her expression sharp, paused beside Maya's row. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice carrying a certain edge that caught Maya off guard. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass." Maya blinked, momentarily confused. "Oh, sure," she said, reaching into her purse. She retrieved the small slip of paper and handed it over. The attendant barely glanced at it before her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm going to have to ask you to step off the plane." A hush settled over the immediate rows as nearby passengers turned their heads. Maya frowned. "I'm sorry, what?" The flight attendant's posture stiffened. "You need to leave the aircraft, ma'am. Now." Maya's heart began to pound. "Can I ask why? I'm in the right seat. My boarding pass is valid." The attendant's eyes flicked toward another crew member, who had stepped forward, looking uncertain. But the blonde attendant remained firm. "I don't have to explain myself. If you don't leave willingly, I'll have to call security." Maya swallowed, feeling a growing wave of embarrassment and confusion. Passengers were whispering now, glancing between her and the flight attendant. "I don't understand," Maya said, her voice steady but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong." The attendant folded her arms, clearly unfazed by the questioning. "You're being non-compliant. Either step off, or we'll remove you." Maya took a deep breath. Years of medical training had taught her how to stay calm in high-pressure situations, but this was something else. There was no explanation, no reasoning, just an order wrapped in authority, and the implied threat that if she didn't obey, things could escalate. Just then, a voice from a few rows back cut through the tense air. "Wait a second, what's going on here?" A middle-aged man in business attire stood up, frowning at the scene unfolding before him. "She's been sitting there the whole time. She hasn't done anything." Other passengers murmured in agreement. The energy in the cabin shifted. It was subtle, but noticeable, a quiet resistance forming. The flight attendant's jaw clenched, but before she could respond, another voice chimed in. This time, it came from the cockpit. "Is there a problem here?" The captain himself had appeared at the entrance to the cabin. His expression neutral, but his presence alone enough to shift the power dynamic. The flight attendant hesitated for just a moment before answering. "No problem, Captain. I was just removing this passenger for non-compliance." The captain's gaze moved to Maya. His brow furrowed. Non-compliance with what, exactly? The silence that followed was deafening. The passengers waited. Maya waited. The flight attendant, for the first time, looked unsure. And then, just 7 minutes later, something happened that no one on that plane could have expected. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, thick with anticipation. Every eye was on the flight attendant now. For the first time, her confident stance wavered. She opened her mouth to respond to the captain, but no words came out. Instead, she flicked a nervous glance toward Maya, then back at the uniformed pilot standing at the front of the plane. Maya could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. She wasn't one to make a scene, but this was something different. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It was humiliating. She had followed every rule, done nothing wrong, and yet, here she was, being told to leave with no explanation. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Some people leaned toward their seatmates, whispering. Others shook their heads in disbelief. A young woman across the aisle, earbuds dangling around her neck, pulled out her phone, her screen glowing as she began recording the interaction. The captain took a slow, measured step forward. "I'll ask again," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What exactly is the issue?" The flight attendant straightened her shoulders, as if trying to regain control of the situation. She stopped, glanced around, then forced a tight smile. She was being disruptive. A scoff came from a few rows back. The businessman who had spoken earlier shook his head. Disruptive? She was literally just sitting there. Maya took a breath. Her pulse was still racing, but she met the captain's gaze. "I haven't said a word since I boarded. I was just waiting for takeoff like everyone else." The captain studied her for a moment, then turned back to the flight attendant. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a sharpness in his eyes. Did she violate any safety protocols? The flight attendant hesitated. No, but... Did she refuse to follow an instruction? Another pause. Well, no, but... Then on what grounds are you asking her to leave? Maya watched as the flight attendant swallowed hard. Her hands clenched at her sides, fingers twitching. It was clear she had expected no resistance, that this was supposed to go smoothly, quickly, that Maya would just get up and leave. The young woman recording the incident shifted in her seat. "This isn't right," she muttered, her voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Others nodded in agreement. The flight attendant's frustration was evident now. She turned to Maya, eyes narrowing. "I don't have to justify my decision. If I say a passenger needs to leave, they need to leave." The captain exhaled, slow and controlled. Then he looked around at the passengers, at the crew members standing nearby, at Maya. And then, 7 minutes after this all began, the unthinkable happened. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Excuse me, this is the airline supervisor speaking. We need to address an urgent matter before departure." Heads turned. Passengers glanced at one another, confusion flickering across their faces. A moment later, a uniformed woman stepped onto the plane, her ID badge clipped to her blazer. She had an air of quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to be announced. Her gaze swept the cabin before locking onto the flight attendant. "Can I speak with you privately for a moment?" The flight attendant hesitated, then nodded stiffly. She followed the supervisor toward the front of the plane, out of earshot but not out of sight. The passengers watched as the two women exchanged hushed words, the supervisor's expression unreadable while the flight attendants turned from defensive to flustered. Maya clenched her fists in her lap. She wasn't the kind to wish misfortune on anyone, but she couldn't ignore the knot of tension in her stomach. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was something more. Something deeper. A few seats away, the businessman leaned toward Maya and spoke in a low voice. "You should file a complaint when you land. This isn't okay." Maya gave a small nod but said nothing. She didn't need to respond. She already knew he was right. The whispered conversation at the front of the plane stretched on for another minute. Then, the flight attendant stiffened, her lips pressed into a thin line. Whatever was being said, it wasn't going in her favor. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the flight attendant turned sharply on her heel and walked past the passengers, straight out of the aircraft. A stunned silence filled the cabin. The supervisor turned back toward the rows of seated passengers. She met Maya's eyes and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before stepping off the plane herself. A beat passed. Then the captain's voice filled the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will be resuming our pre-flight procedures. Please remain in your seats as we prepare for departure." The tension broke, but not completely. Passengers exchanged glances, some whispering, others shaking their heads. The young woman with the phone was still recording, her fingers flying over the screen as she typed something, likely sharing what had just happened with the rest of the world. Maya exhaled, finally allowing herself to breathe. But even as the plane began to move, even as the hum of the engines filled the cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. The cabin had settled into a tense silence, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air like an unspoken question. Maya sat still, staring out the window, but her mind was racing. She should have felt relieved, maybe even victorious, but instead, there was just a strange unease curling in her chest. The flight attendant was gone, walked off the plane like she had never been there in the first place. But the way she had looked, the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her lips had pressed together in frustration, it didn't sit right. A low voice broke through her thoughts. "You okay?" She turned to see the businessman leaning slightly in her direction, concern etched into his face. "I think so," she replied, though she wasn't entirely sure. He shook his head. "That was unreal. I've flown more times than I can count, and I've never seen anything like that." Maya forced a small smile, but it faded quickly. "I don't understand what I did wrong." "You didn't do anything wrong," he said firmly. "That was personal." Personal. The word hung between them, heavy with implication. The engines roared softly as the plane began taxiing toward the runway. The hum of conversation picked up again, passengers beginning to talk in hushed voices, some clearly still processing what had happened. A few rows ahead, the young woman who had recorded everything was whispering to a man beside her, her phone still in her hand. Maya didn't know her, but she could tell just from the way she was speaking that she was already uploading the video somewhere. Social media, maybe even the news. Maya wasn't sure how she felt about that. She had never wanted attention. She just wanted to get home. But something about the way the flight attendant had looked at her, the way she had insisted Maya leave the plane without a single valid reason, left a strange sense of unfinished business hanging in the air. As the plane lifted off, climbing steadily into the sky, Maya leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. But even as the world grew smaller beneath them, she knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. 2 hours into the flight, the tension had eased, but it hadn't disappeared. The cabin lights had dimmed, and most passengers were either dozing off or quietly watching their screens. But Maya couldn't sleep. She glanced at her phone, debating whether to check the internet, but a part of her hesitated. She wasn't ready to see whatever had been posted about the incident yet. Instead, she stood and made her way to the back of the plane, stretching her legs and getting a glass of water from one of the remaining flight attendants. The woman handed it to her with a polite nod, but there was something else in her expression, something unreadable. Maya hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" The flight attendant glanced over her shoulder before stepping slightly closer. "Of course." That woman, the one who... Maya trailed off, unsure how to phrase it. The flight attendant understood immediately. Her expression flickered, and she exhaled. "Listen, I can't say much. But I will say this, it wasn't about you." Maya frowned. "What do you mean?" The woman shook her head, lowering her voice. "It wasn't about you, but it became about you. That only made things more confusing." "That doesn't make sense." The flight attendant glanced around the dimly lit cabin before leaning in slightly. "Just, when you land, check the news." Before Maya could ask anything else, the woman stepped back, straightened her uniform, and walked off to tend to another passenger. Maya stood there for a moment, her heart pounding. Whatever had just happened, whatever she had been dragged into, it was bigger than she realized. Maya returned to her seat, her mind buzzing with questions. It wasn't about her, but it became about her? What did that even mean? She tried to push the thought aside, but it clung to her, refusing to let go. She reached for her phone again, this time deciding to check online. As soon as she unlocked the screen, the notifications started rolling in. Messages, missed calls, and news alerts filled the display. Her fingers hovered over one of the headlines. Doctor removed from flight without cause. Passenger video goes viral. Her stomach tightened. She clicked on the link, and there it was, a shaky but clear video capturing the entire moment from the time the flight attendant demanded she leave to the second she was escorted away. The comments were already piling up. This is unacceptable. She did nothing wrong. Airlines need to be held accountable for this. The video had already reached thousands of views, and it was still climbing. Maya swallowed, suddenly feeling exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just a few passengers who had witnessed it, it was the world now. A movement from the row ahead caught her attention. The young woman who had recorded the video turned in her seat, her eyes lighting up as she saw Maya. "Hey," she whispered. "Are you seeing this?" Maya hesitated before nodding. "This is huge," the woman continued, keeping her voice low. "People are demanding answers. The airline hasn't said anything yet, but they're going to have to." Maya wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse. She had spent years building a reputation in her field, carefully maintaining professionalism and keeping her name out of unnecessary controversy. Now, in just a few hours, she had become a headline. A new notification popped up, a direct message from an unknown number. "Call me when you land. It's important." There was no name, no context, but something about it sent a chill down her spine. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing they would begin their descent soon. Maya stared at the message, debating whether to ignore it. But deep down, she knew, this wasn't over. As the plane dipped below the clouds, the city lights sprawling beneath them, the weight of what was coming settled over her like a storm waiting to break. As the plane touched down, Maya's heart pounded harder than she wanted to admit. She had been through tense situations before, emergency surgeries, high-pressure medical decisions, but this was different. This was something she couldn't control. The moment the wheels hit the ground, her phone buzzed again. The same unknown number. She hesitated before swiping the notification away. Not yet. First, she needed to get off this plane and figure out what exactly was waiting for her on the other side. Passengers shifted restlessly as the plane taxied to the gate. People were still whispering, stealing glances at her as if she were some kind of celebrity. The businessman from earlier gave her a nod of support. The young woman who had recorded everything mouthed, "Good luck." Maya forced a tight smile but felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She grabbed her carry-on, steeling herself for whatever came next. As soon as the doors opened, the usual shuffle of passengers filing out began. But the second Maya stepped into the jet bridge, she noticed something was off. A small group of people stood near the entrance to the terminal. 2 airline representatives, a security officer, and someone in a dark suit who looked completely out of place. They were waiting for her. Her pulse quickened. One of the airline reps, a woman with neatly tied back hair and a forced smile, stepped forward. "Dr. Taylor?" Maya stopped, gripping the strap of her bag a little tighter. "Yes. We need to have a word with you before you leave the airport," the woman said, her tone overly polite but firm. Maya's mind raced. Was this about the flight attendant, the viral video, or something else entirely? Before she could respond, the man in the dark suit stepped forward. "Dr. Taylor, I'm Agent Carter. I work with federal aviation authorities. This situation has escalated beyond what we expected, and I need to ask you a few questions." Maya's stomach dropped. "Federal authorities? I don't understand," she said carefully. "What situation?" Agent Carter exchanged a glance with the airline rep before speaking. "There's more to this than you realize. And you're at the center of it." Maya's breath caught. Whatever she had been pulled into, it was bigger than she thought. Maya's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag as she studied Agent Carter's expression. He wasn't just delivering routine questions. There was something heavier beneath his words, something that made her pulse race. "I don't understand," she repeated. "What exactly am I at the center of?" Agent Carter gestured for her to step aside, away from the flow of passengers leaving the terminal. The airline rep looked uneasy, glancing toward security as if hoping someone else would step in. Maya swallowed hard but followed. She had no choice. Carter lowered his voice. "The flight attendant who tried to remove you, she wasn't acting alone." Maya's stomach clenched. "What does that mean?" He exhaled, glancing at the security officer beside him. "We received information that there was an internal issue within the airline. Certain staff targeting passengers under the guise of disruptive behavior to have them removed. It was a pattern, and we've been tracking it." Maya blinked, barely able to process what she was hearing. "So, I was targeted." Carter gave a tight nod. "Yes. But here's where it gets complicated. The reason you were targeted may not have been random." Maya's heart pounded. "I don't know anyone at this airline. Why would they single me out?" Carter hesitated before pulling out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward her. Maya's breath caught as she saw a still image from an airport security camera, one taken before she even boarded the flight. In the background, near the gate, was the flight attendant. But she wasn't alone. She was speaking to a man Maya didn't recognize, but there was something about him, something unsettling. He wore dark clothes, his posture tense. He wasn't just a passenger. Carter's voice was measured. "We believe this man is connected to someone from your past." Maya's mind raced. "My past?" "We ran facial recognition," Carter continued. "He's linked to a malpractice lawsuit filed against a hospital you worked at 3 years ago." Maya felt like the floor had been ripped out from under her. She had been involved in dozens of cases, but only one had ever escalated to something truly dangerous. A lawsuit involving a wealthy, influential family who had lost a loved one despite her best efforts. "This can't be a coincidence," she murmured. Carter nodded. "It's not. The airline had its own issues, but this situation was different. It was intentional. Someone wanted you off that flight." A cold shiver ran down Maya's spine. If she had been removed, she would have been stranded, alone, in an unfamiliar airport. Vulnerable. She inhaled sharply. "The flight attendant. Where is she now?" Carter's jaw tightened. "She's gone." Maya's pulse spiked. "Gone? What do you mean?" "She left the airport before we could detain her," he said. "No one knows where she went." A deep unease settled in Maya's chest. This wasn't just about airline misconduct. It was personal. Someone was still out there, watching, waiting. And this wasn't over. Not yet. Maya's mind was spinning. She had boarded that flight thinking it was just another routine trip home. Now, she was standing in an airport terminal, hearing that someone had deliberately tried to remove her, and the person behind it had vanished. She exhaled, trying to steady herself. "So what happens now?" Agent Carter studied her for a moment before speaking. "We've already alerted the authorities in multiple cities. If she tries to board another flight or leave the country, we'll know." Maya swallowed. That wasn't exactly reassuring. "And what about the man she was talking to?" "We're still looking into him," Carter said. "But if what we suspect is true, this isn't just about an airline targeting passengers. This was personal. Someone wanted you isolated." A chill ran down her spine. She thought back to that lawsuit, the heated arguments, the threats she had dismissed as empty words, the lingering sense that something wasn't quite over. She had moved on, but maybe they hadn't. The airline representative cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Dr. Taylor, I just want to personally apologize for what happened. The company is taking this very seriously, and we will be conducting a full internal investigation." Maya nodded, but she barely heard her. Right now, apologies didn't mean much. She just wanted answers. A deep exhaustion settled over her. She had planned to go straight home after landing, but now, everything felt different. She wasn't sure she wanted to be alone right now. She turned back to Carter. "Am I in danger?" Carter hesitated, then spoke carefully. "We don't think there's an immediate threat, but I'd advise being cautious. Keep your phone on, stay aware of your surroundings. If anything seems off, report it." Maya's chest tightened, but she nodded. She had spent years saving lives, making tough calls, standing firm in crisis situations. She wasn't going to let fear control her now. "Do you have someone who can pick you up?" Carter asked. Maya thought for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I'll call someone." She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a familiar name, her closest friend, someone she trusted. As she pressed the call button, she glanced around the terminal, her gaze flicking over the sea of faces. Everything felt normal. Too normal. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Maya? You okay?" She took a breath. "I'll explain everything later. Can you pick me up?" "Of course. I'm on my way." Relief washed over her. She wasn't alone in this. She turned back to Carter. "Thank you." He nodded. "We'll be in touch." With that, he walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Maya adjusted the strap of her bag and started toward the exit, but the feeling in her chest didn't fade. This was over for now, but something told her this was just the beginning of a much bigger story.